I see that some people are still entering. So that's all right, because it's the moment when I'm going to introduce the speech. Just for the record, I didn't work on Full Throttle. I wish I had, but I was a bit young. But that's one of my favorite games ever, and one of my favorite piece of dialogue, so that's why it's here. So hello again. My name is Sarah Beaulieu. I'll be talking for about 45 minutes, and hopefully that will leave you and us actually 10 minutes for questions. And if we don't, again, I will gladly speak with you after, because I love talking to people. As you noticed, probably I'm French, so sometimes my accent kicks in, and I hope everything will be understandable. I'm sorry in advance for that. We'll start by the phase before writing, which is the phase of defining the needs and constraints of your game and your specific needs on dialogue. Then there is the reading phase, and that is the phase where we're going to start talking about how and why you should help people reading your script correctly. And then the after writing phase, which is the art of giving and receiving feedbacks. I'm not going to talk about dialogue writing methods per se, but mainly about how you can improve the way you think about dialogue beforehand and how you can communicate with your team better. That would be audio, realization, game design, etc., to ensure the best quality and consistency possible for your dialogue. I have done many mistakes in my career. I have learned from them, but actually the more I learn, the more I realize how little I know. And that is also why I'm here today, to learn from all of you. So again, come speak to me afterwards, especially if you disagree with everything I'm going to share today. And it's going to be mostly tips. I want to share some mistakes that I did, and I want to share them with you so that maybe you can learn from them, hopefully. Starting with a little bit about myself. So I've been a writer for 12 years now. I've started my career in movies, mostly, as a script doctor, most of the time. I wrote and directed plays, I wrote short novels, I crafted a few short stories too, a few short movies as well. I love doing some weird narrative experiments. I worked for indie games, I worked for AAA games, virtual reality projects as a writer and as a narrative designer. And most recently, I was the narrative director on Assassin's Creed Mirage. And as side activities, I'm also a consultant, I'm also a narrative, I'm speaking a lot about narrative, like today. I published a few papers on world building, that is a passion of mine, and virtual reality storytelling. And one of the things I enjoy the most is, and that probably is relevant today, is working with actors. On a final note, as I already said, come speak to me later, please, I love that. And I'm here for this. We're going to start with the needs and constraints of your project and how this is going to influence your writing. And this is something I like to start with, usually. It is not so much the story that matters, but the way in which that story is told. So let me explain a little bit more what I mean by that. When you start writing for a game, you define what we call, at least I like to call it that way, the narrative means, that are the tools that you're going to use to convey the narrative throughout the game. It can be systems, it can be mechanics, it can be environment, etc. And among those narrative means, you have dialogues. But dialogue is only one of many narrative means. So using dialogue for very specific narrative needs is both a narrative choice and a design choice. So let's call it a narrative design choice. It has to be meaningful, it has to be necessary, and choosing dialogue as a narrative tool will be expensive, it will be difficult, it would require a specific scope, so this is not something to take lightly. So of course you can also choose to work with dialogues for specific design needs, and that's okay, but still this is going to have very, very important impact on your production. So before anything, think hard about why you need dialogue in your game and how they will support the narrative and the gameplay. And once you've done that, Well, you have two things to work on to start with. That's just the beginning. One is defining when information will be conveyed through dialogue in your game, and two, which type of dialogue you will use to best support your needs. Again, will it be narrative or design? Of course, again, this only applies if you're using dialogue as a narrative mean, and this is not like, in Limbo or Little Nightmares or Inside, or every game which doesn't use dialogue, obviously. These are actually perfect examples, and ones that I love, that don't need dialogue to convey narrative. They found their own way, and in these typical examples, that's environment, and that's totally fine, but obviously that's not what we're going to talk about today. And before we dive more into this, here is a quick tip from me. Define and lock the major plot points of your story as early as possible, and if possible. This is actually to ensure that they are considered in production costs and are feasible. Of course, in any case, even with all the precautions in the world, you all know that we work in the video game industry and a cut can happen at any time. This is why it's important as much as possible to lock the spine of your narrative and the elements that would be irremovable after a certain point in production without huge impact. That's something that I actually understood very quickly when I entered video games, is that video games production teams, they tend to forget, really much often, they tend to forget that a story is made of setup and payoff. And if you remove one of those, you're going to have something that I like to call a Frankenstein project, which is a project with very, very ugly and visible scars that shows where you cut and how little you could actually fix the scar afterwards. So let's start by going over a few types of dialogue that you can use, and that's not an exhaustive list. Typically, you have two main ways of using dialogue in video games. That is when the player is active, is in an active state, or in a passive state. So let's go into details. The following list I'm not going to give you is not exhaustive, and it will depend, again, of your production choices and constraints. On a side note, and for the sake of this particular presentation, I'm calling dialogue even single individual lines. For example, NPC calling you, you come over here, calling the other player would be considered dialogue. Just keep that in mind. All right, so starting with the first kind of active dialogue, and that would be scripted lines, what I call scripted lines, or GP, gameplay lines, and that is lines that are going to happen once in the game in a very specific situation during gameplay. So like here in the Stanley Parable, this is happening when the player is active. The second type, no, that's not the second type, that's a specific type of scripted lines that we like to call, especially Ubisoft, we call that walk and talk. Walk and talk, that is typically the moment when you ride a horse or drive a car or walk with an NPC, and the NPC is talking to you and you respond back to the NPC. That's another example from Red Dead Redemption 2, which has a lot of walk and talks. That is another example from Uncharted 4, typically driving. These lines, again, happen when the player is active, so scripted sequences. Then you would have AI lines. So just to make it clear, because we talk about AI a lot these days, that's not generated by AI. That's lines that are triggered at specific times during the game, so conditional lines, most often with variations. So typically, I like to call them bugs, and I'm not the only one. This can happen during fights, typically, or warning the player that they are wounded, for example. It can be reactions from the crowd, what we also call ambient lines. It's a merchant calling out for you, etc. So that's an example from Morrowind. We make special trip just for you, same low price. That's a typical AI line from an NPC that can be triggered several times with variations when the conditions are met. So these lines are not actively triggered by the player, but the player is still active during those phases. Then we would have interactive dialogue that you all know of. You can have interactive dialogue with no choices, like here, just a simple interaction to move to the next line, or interactive dialogues with choices, and these are two examples from Cyberpunk. Typical choice. And that's an example that I like to put in there. That's Oxenfree. If you don't know Oxenfree is a great example of a beautifully crafted dialogue system. We could do a whole talk about dialogue systems because this is such a wide and interesting topic, but the key thing to note today about Oxenfree dialogue and the dialogue system is how fluid it is. It's so integrated, it's so well integrated into the flow of the game that it really becomes a core part of the gameplay. It allows the player both to interact, so to be active, while also walking in the game's world. This is actually an amazing example of interactive dialogue. And now passive dialogue, and these are moments when you can actually grab a coffee and go have a snack, and the game will continue without you and go on with the story. This is actually cutscenes. And of course, there is an exception. There are always exceptions, like cutscenes with QTE. Quantic does that a lot. Many examples from them. And that's basically it. Passive dialogue is cutscenes. So to recap, we would have these two big families with one single family. Passive is cutscenes, and active, so scripted lines triggered once in a specific scripted situation. AI lines, so AI being triggered several times with variations. And interactive dialogue with or without choices. So the type or types of dialogue that you're going to use depend on your narrative and design intentions. I keep saying that, but that's very important. Oxenfree obviously doesn't have the same narrative and design intention as, say, Skyrim. Skyrim doesn't have the same narrative and design intention as Spiritfarer, and Spiritfarer doesn't have the same narrative and design intention as Elden Ring. So you get my point. Each project has different intentions, and you must build your dialogue system and types of dialogues from these intentions, and that's very important for them to be effective and, most importantly, to be meaningful. I will say meaningful a lot today. That's because I come from story. Here is a very simple example. We're talking about where you're going to put your dialogues now, but here is a very simple example of a gameplay sequence, very high-level document. So in this example, I'm sorry. You would start in a, let's say, a space station, whatever, and the PC, so player character, is waking up. You have a release to gameplay after this cutscene into the space station, and you probably would have, I don't know, two choices. First choice is to interact with a window, and in that case, you have a GP line being triggered, a scripted line, saying that in this case, they don't recognize the place. Or you can interact with the bed, and they actually have a GP line saying, I don't remember falling asleep. And then you would go into another cutscene that is the PC opening the door to the station's busy hallway. That's an example of a very high-level document, so you can have a view of your gameplay beats and the information you're going to provide throughout dialogue here. But by cutting chunks like that in your gameplay beats very early on and identifying the information given in each dialogue, you will quickly have a better view, a better overview of the beginning, at the beginning of the project, and how your dialogues will be written in consequence and later integrated in the game. So now that you have defined which types of dialogue you're going to use in your game and where, this is a topic I'd like to speak about because it's very dear to my heart. It's narrative-driven dialogue and gameplay-driven dialogue. So what is the topic here? Good question. Balancing narrative and design can be tough. I guess you all know that, especially if the game you're working on is not what we would call and I hate this term, but a narrative-driven game, meaning that narrative is never going to be the project's #1 priority, and we know those games exist. In a movie or a play, a dialogue will mainly support plot or characterization, but in a game, there are certain dialogue which primary function is to move the gameplay forward. And that doesn't necessarily mean the story, because sometimes you don't have a story per se. Sometimes during your project, or maybe always, depending on your company, gameplay needs will come first, and you will have to try and squeeze narrative stuff in there, if relevant and if possible. So here's what you can do to see where you're going with that. And that would be establishing the primary function of the dialogue in a specific situation. So that means, what is the dialogue meant for in the first place, in this dialogue? Is it a gameplay intention? So is it to give a gameplay information? I hope that you can see the examples right, but the line in white here, so it says, we are not done, it's yours, the gold. It's clearly gameplay oriented. This is a dialogue that has the primary function to let the player know they have a choice. So here taking the gold or not. In many games with dialogue choices, like here in The Witcher 3, dialogue that lead to a specific gameplay action are often supported by UI, like here, using a different color or typo, for example. And here is another cool example, a very recent one, Spider-Man saying that arm looks dangerous, obviously hinting to the player to watch out for the NPC's arm during the fight. And this kind of gameplay information are obviously often used during tutorial sequences, like in this one. Is the primary function of the dialogue to give an information on the quest. So in this example, that's a game that I love. The NPC is giving a quest to the player clearly. Have you heard about the ghost of Bessie Toon? This is a dialogue which primary function is clearly to move the quest forward. So the player knows that this is going to lead to the next quest beat. Is it to give a narrative-driven information? So the dialogue primary function can actually be to move the plot forward, and only to move the plot forward if you have a plot, again. Also, one could argue that quest and plot are the same thing, but that's a discussion and an argument that I could have with you later if you wish. Here, this is a cutscene that will lead to the sitting incident in Full Throttle. So the dialogue primary function is to move the plot forward, to inform the player on what's going on in the story. Is it to give, is the primary function of the dialogue to give a characterization information, to characterize the character? So when you think of characterization as a primary function, think of it as this is something only this character would say. And this dialogue will help supporting the narrative by showing who this character is. So that's a good example from Spiritfarer, a very good game. The player has to take the old lady's arm at some point and bring her back to a boat they came from. And this is in gameplay, and the old lady is losing her mind, and she keeps saying "good day, sir" to every NPC, or to sometimes nobody. So she's absolutely losing her mind. This is pure characterization. It doesn't give any plot information, any new plot information, any quest information, gameplay, or whatsoever. It's the actual primary and only function of this dialogue. So this is also what we call sometimes flavor dialogue. And sometimes the primary function of the dialogue can be to inform the player on the world they are in. So what is happening in it. So for example, here, that's what we call also exposition dialogue. The voiceover is saying, it's beautiful, is this what it used to look like, the world? So the player understands with this dialogue that the world, as we know it, has probably disappeared. This is mainly a lore information, even though it also helps the plot moving forward. I'm only talking about primary function here. So again, if we separate these dialogues in two big families, we would have narrative-driven dialogue on one side and gameplay dialogue on the other side. So supporting gameplay and quest mainly. But this is just a spectrum, and let me insist on that. I'm standing in front of you also as a narrative designer, and the core of my job is to actually balance narrative and design. So, of course, you can have a dialogue which primary function is to move the plot forward, but also to give a major gameplay information. Or you can have a dialogue which primary function is to give a gameplay information, but with strong characterization as a second layer. Good dialogue is actually a balance between the two. So that's another example. I like to take recent examples and not only Full Throttle. That's an example from Spider-Man 2. It's a gameplay information during the first fight. Throwing stuff at Sandman will harm him. But the line is also a line that Spider-Man would say. It's a funny one. So even during a fight, Spider-Man can be funny. That's characterization. So it's a gameplay information first, but it's also characterization for Spider-Man. French accent, see? Okay. So while on this process of preparing for the writing phase myself, several times I've made those mistakes a few times. I've made two mistakes that I would like to share with you, just like I mean, hopefully you won't do the same. The first mistake was relying on cutscenes for significant story moments without fully understanding what was technically and financially feasible. And I know it happens a lot to a lot of us. So basically, with other words, I locked my plot points and therefore some cutscenes without making sure that this would be doable and having a validation from the cinematic team, basically. I overestimated the player's attention capacity when dialogues happen during gameplay moments. So, for example, walk-in talks. So what were the consequences to that? Well, some important cutscenes happened to be too costly and therefore impossible to produce, and they were replaced with dialogue during walk-in talks or during gameplay moments in general, so scripted lines, as I was telling you about earlier. And as a chain reaction, the important information were lost because the player was often preoccupied by other in-game actions. And I want to show you a clear example from Assassin's Creed Mirage. If you don't see the dialogue, that's all right. That's just to illustrate. That's a walk and talk at the beginning of the game, and Roshan, the first character here, explains to Basim, that's the player character, that the men he encountered earlier in the story are actually part of what we call the Order in the Assassin's Creed lore, and Roshan explains to Basim that the Order has held dominion over the empires for centuries. That is a crucial information for many reasons, but mostly because it's supposed to drive the player into the quest. It actually gives a stake to the story. It's a very, very important information. And that's actually why the player should care for the main quest. And what happened is the important information in there were diluted in the gameplay moment. The player was active. They were actually discovering a new setting, and that is Alamut, very famous fortress in the world of AC. And they would likely be looking around, and that's what happened during playtests, actually. They were looking around, trying to follow the character, Roshan's space. They weren't paying attention to the dialogue. They missed most of this dialogue. The dialogue was heavy with information, too heavy for the time we had in this particular space that was designed earlier. Mainly because the dialogue was supposed to be in a cutscene, and we couldn't do that afterwards. The space was not designed for this specific dialogue, so as a consequence, the dialogue is too long, the pacing is not good, and we don't have the full player's attention on this scene, and that is a big, big issue. So that would be a little piece of advice from me, if I can give some advice, but that would be as much as possible avoid overwhelming the player with different types of information like that. If essential story-related information is conveyed through dialogue during gameplay, try to reduce cognitive load as much as possible by simplifying the gameplay, so no combat, no discovering of a new location, or shorter dialogues. If you have in-game dialogues like that, handcraft them. Handcraft the moments by adding realization, handle the pacing of the dialogue for the player to be able to really hear what's being said. And this is my transition to the part about the first steps in the process of writing dialogue. We'll now dive into the process of reading scripts. And that's one of my favorite phases because I've been a script doctor for a long time. And I still am, sorry. So in this part of the presentation, I'm going to try to give you a few tips again on how to make sure you communicate with the other teams about your dialogues as best as possible. And that's something I like to say a lot, and that my team doesn't like to hear, but that's true. Not everyone knows how to read a script. In a team where you have to collaborate and iterate to deliver the best result possible, it is crucial for you that people understand what you're doing and where you're heading with your script. And for this to happen, try to ease the reading and feedbacks process for everyone, including yourself, otherwise you're going to go crazy. I'm just that from being crazy now. This is a screenplay. I guess lots of you know what a screenplay looks like. Even though that's a movie script, in this example, it has the same structure and indications a cutscene in a video game would have. Location, time of day, action lines, transitions, dialogue, parenthetical, etc., etc. And the most important thing for me to say at that point is scripts, as you can see, if you never saw a script before, have their formatting rules. They are a tool, and I like to say that a lot. They are a tool, and as you know, every tool, they require some previous knowledge on how to read them, how to make feedbacks on them, and we'll see that afterwards. So how to read them too and analyze them correctly. So because of that, for someone who does not have this knowledge in your team or simply has trouble visualizing from text only, a script can often be perceived as dry and difficult to dive into and to work from. So I'm going back to this statement, not everyone knows how to read a script. And of course, this is a script example on a side note, but many writers use Excel spreadsheets to write in-game dialogues, that's all right, or other tools in case of complex branching. But in these sections, I'll talk about scenes rather than independent lines, even though some of the tips I'm going to give you are going to be valid for independent lines too. Again, you want everybody to understand where you're going with your narrative, and this is the tool that all the teams working on dialogues are going to get their information from. So mainly audio team, realization team, animation team, quest team, etc. This is why you need solutions to help them work from text to screen. And this is why I would recommend a few things. So first, to ease the process of reading a script, write action lines that help visualizing the action. That means use the words and typo in the text as tools to convey the visuals in your scene. And here is a great example, also from a movie script, but if you haven't read it, it's a first version of a movie called A Quiet Place. So the script is from Scott Beck and Brian Woods, and that's a very, very good example of what you can do. For example, emphasizing on specific lines. Here you can see his daughter is not with them, is underlined. This actually shows directly in text the surprise, the horror of the character at that point. You can also use caps, like here, or play with the size of the letters to convey an emotion, or a pacing, or a specific staging, or a specific shot, actually. This will also help people who have a hard time reading long texts. That happen a lot. Use these tricks as much as possible when it's relevant. Convey your vision through action lines as much as possible. Use the text format, and honestly, I can tell you this is a great tool, and this is working a little bit like magic sometimes. Here is a simple trick we use as scriptwriters. I'm giving you this tip, don't use it too much. That helps creating mental images without asking for a specific shot, because as script writers, we often learn that, and that's true. Directors, they don't like to be, they don't like to see which shots you would like them to use. So we find tricks to convey that through text only. So example, exterior garden night, an apple, a hen grabs the apple. So that's a very simple introduction, but here, the first thing that should actually come to your mind in terms of shot is probably a close shot of the apple, and then the hand entering the shot to grab the apple. So these mental images actually are simply created by the fact that I only mentioned the apple. That's very simple. I didn't mention the garden, but I could have written that differently. It would be exterior garden night. Adam is waiting under an apple tree. He bends down and grabs an apple on the floor. So now you're probably seeing Adam first, and then the apple tree, so probably a long shot, and then maybe a closer one with the apple being grabbed by Adam's hand, so probably different types of shot on this one. So this example, and these examples, they look simple, but if you manage to actually write good and efficient visual action lines to drive your reader's attention, it will help greatly communicating with your team from the script first, even to untrained readers. Storyboard. So hire a storyboard artist if you can afford it, because it will help the team, and including you visualizing the shots, even if it's an in-game dialogue and not a cutscene, really. That's an example from Inception. You can even push it further and do an animatic out of it, so animate the storyboard and see the whole thing in motion to have a better idea of the staging and the pacing. And actually, level designers, they love that too. Visual references, so that's a pretty straightforward one, but actually it works. Use as many references as you can. Add that to any additional document, story beats document, for example. If you use those, it helps the team visualizing your attention on specific dialogue moments. And it works, again, for in-game dialogue and not only for cutscenes. And this is one more side note on how to ease the reading process, the good use of parenthetical. So parenthetical, for those of you who don't know what it is an extra information you give the actor for them to understand what the intention of the line is. So some actors actually don't like them a lot or don't like them at all because it can be seen as, driving the performance too much and stepping on the actor's territory, which is kind of true. But in our case, because we're working in video games and we have very strict deadlines when it comes to recordings, for example, parenthetical can be very important. And this will be very useful for other departments, such as cinematic designers first, animators, voiceovers, etc. Voice designers. So use parenthetical. That's a very simple example, and I'm going to have to warn you that I'm not an actor, so I can't do it properly, but you can see the parenthetical here is playful and ironic, so probably smiling. This is not what I meant. And then you would have the same line, humorlessly, and this is not what I meant. So that's two different intentions, but if you're recording, and that's sometimes happening, the actors in two different booths, and you have an answer to this actually line separately, and the other actor doesn't know about the first intention, they're probably going to answer in a very weird way. So if you have cinematic designers who don't know about the specific intention and they're going to start working on the animation, that can happen before the line is recorded, then you will have major inconsistencies between cinematics, between two actors, between different voice directors, and that can happen too if you have many voice directors. So one mistake I made, actually, on this one, I made a lot of mistakes, I told you, is thinking the parenthetical was actually enough for everyone to be aligned on the dialogue intention. But the key thing to understand here is if you're not here during recording sessions, you or someone who actually directs and knows the scene, the character and everything in the whole game, it can be damaging. The character won't necessarily get the dynamic between two characters at this point of the game. They may ignore the parenthetical because they don't like it. Maybe the voice director themselves are not, don't have that can happen, doesn't have the overview on the whole game and whole narrative. So go to the booth or bring someone who can go to the booth and make sure that the game is consistent in terms of intentions in the dialogue. That is a very concrete example from my most recent game, so Mirage. This is a scene where Rebecca up here and Basim actually tease each other. This happens at different points in the game. This is a dynamic between the two. They always mock each other, and this is a friendly game. This is very friendly between them. But in the recording sessions, I was not there for Rebecca's sessions because I had other sessions to attend, and this formation was lost between the two voice directors, and later between cinematics, between audio and narrative. That was a whole mess, and it ended up at some point that when we actually saw the first version of these scenes with the two characters, we had this very weird exchange between them, and it sounded really weird because they were not tuned on the same intentions. So again, be careful with parenthetical, use them, but they don't guarantee that the intentions are going to be there at the end. So be there, again, in the recording sessions, or bring someone who can be there for you. And we're entering the last phase, and that's the after writing phase. And yeah, we should be all right in terms of pacing, I guess. Okay. Not everyone knows how to read a script. Did I already say that? Yes, I'm saying it again. So let me clarify and go a little bit deeper. Not everyone knows how to fix a script. So what can you do to ensure that you have the most useful feedbacks on the story and dialogues, again, if you have a story, and that you can give actionable feedbacks to your writers or to yourself if you're a writer yourself? Sorry. There are multiple points of entry when you analyze a story. originality, themes, character, structure, pacing, tension, conflict, and dialogues. So that's something I took from a French consultant, and I can give you the reference after if you're interested, but it's only in French, and he's called Yves Lavandier. So when you start analyzing a story, you can start by all these entries, and as you can see, dialogue is only one of them. And therefore, it's quite difficult for someone in your team who is not in the narrative team to have an overview, I would say, on the whole narrative, to give you useful feedbacks on dialogues per se. So that's a whole slide. Giving meaningful feedbacks on dialogue most often requires an understanding of the whole narrative. And this is actually very important to keep in mind. A story, again, is like a puzzle. Everything has a specific place, and if you remove one of these pieces, you have to understand the implications of doing so and what this is going to actually destroy in your story. So now, what can you do to gather the most useful feedbacks possible? So that's the script doctor approach. So again, that was my whole life for a few years in movies. These are three steps, again theorized by Yves Lavandier, so the French consultant, and they are key to my point of view, actually, to understand people's roles and expertise inside a team when it comes to giving or receiving feedbacks on dialogues. So the first steps is actually the symptoms. We're talking a script doctor approach here. This cannot be ignored. So if you're going to the doctor because your stomach hurts, the doctor can't say to you, no, your stomach doesn't hurt. Actually, it does hurt. So that's something that goes, it's the same thing for the story or dialogue in any case. If you're reading something and you're feeling bored, or you're feeling disappointed, or you're feeling surprised, etc., that cannot be ignored. So at that point in the process, actually, you can ask everyone in your team what they're feeling about the dialogue. And everything should be heard. Nothing should be ignored. But step 2 is the diagnosis. So again, if we take this doctor metaphor, you said to the doctor that your stomach hurts, and the doctor is going to find what the problem is, but that's actually very, very important because you don't want to have a wrong diagnosis. And at that point, we're only at step 2, but someone who doesn't have the knowledge might not be relevant in giving the right diagnosis. For example, the diagnosis would be, I was bored during this scene because the character's motivation was unclear. That's a diagnosis. And at that point, you should be very careful on who you involve on giving the diagnosis. Not everybody is a doctor. You can still take feedbacks, but be aware that the diagnosis, in the end, must be good and precise, because that's the last step, and that's the prescription phase. So if you're sure of the diagnosis, then you will find the right prescription. So for example, if the player's character motivation wasn't clear, then you will decide on rewriting the scene and add another layer of information on this motivation, for example, or else you choose the prescription. But again, if the diagnosis wasn't right, the prescription won't be either, and you will end up with something actually worse than before. So that's, again, like going to the doctor and having your stomach hurting, and he's giving you a prescription for a disease that you don't have. And you're probably going to feel a little bit worse after that. So therefore, again, at this step, you should trust only people who know what they are doing with story and dialogue. Even though you should be careful with that, I know, and we all know, that you have some people who have to be involved because they have to validate the script, or they have to have visibility on it, and that is totally normal. So of course they should be involved in the process of reviews, and that is why you can have table reads. So table reads are usually moments when actors, writers, producers are involved in a meeting around a table and writing the script together. It's usually in movies or theater that we do that. But in our case, and in video games, it works too. I'd like to introduce table reads as a solution for you to align, actually to be closer to alignment with your team, and to iterate with people who will work on the script afterwards. So who to include? That depends on your projects, obviously, but that could be either directors, leads, voiceovers, voice designers, cinematic designers, quest mission designers, animators, etc. That really depends on your project and your needs. Whoever needs to understand the script to work from it or to validate it. And this includes also people who will have to make feedbacks. So what are the benefits of table reads? Well, reading with stakeholders will help avoiding misunderstandings on the script. That happens a lot, and we saw an example with the dialogue intention. For them, this is the time to actually ask questions, raise concerns, for example, give feedbacks to the writing team, if you want them to do so at that point. Identify quest or mission issues. So in addition to pure story elements, your script may support specific quest beats, for example, or tutorial, as we saw earlier with Spider-Man 2. So this is a time to identify possible inconsistencies with these departments specifically, because we're making games. Identifying needs or constraints from other departments. So this is a moment, for example, for your cinematic designer to jump in and say that this won't be doable. Or for a quest designer to actually ask for another quest beat, or for the game designer to ask for a new naming for a weapon, for example. And for the writing team, so for you and your team, etc., what would be the benefits of a table read? So that could help actually identify the plot and characterization issues that you could have and you could have missed before. Hearing people reading your text out loud is actually pretty magic and really, really enlightening, I would say. Damage control. We like damage control. If other team members read and understand the script at that point, they are given the opportunity to make feedbacks earlier. That's very, very precious. And raise flags. Sorry. After writing, so one last big mistake I made, and that is actually allowing too many people to comment on the script in documents and to attend script lock meetings. I was trying to make sure everybody understood everything, and actually that was not possible. So define, really, when you want to do that, define what table reads and dedicated script meetings should be for. So is it for reviewing the script? Is it for raising flags? What's the specific intention of this meeting? And let people maybe know what the script looks like before. Then you have to choose who to gather in the room. So you may have to decide if you want to invite the writers, if you have writers in your team. Someone from the narrative team should obviously be there to take notes and make sure they filter the comments and understand the feedbacks. But ideally, this is the role of a lead writer or narrative director or both of them. But including many people plus the writers actually can be an issue, and that's a big mistake I did. Being a writer myself, I'm still feeling very guilty about that. But writers actually need meaningful and they need to be comfortable with the feedbacks they're receiving. You're going to say that's the same thing for everyone, sure. But as we discussed on the previous slides, not everybody knows how to read a script and not everybody knows how to fix a script. And usually in these meetings, everybody wants to find solution. This can lead to very, very messy meetings with bad diagnosis and bad prescriptions, and that's the worst. Reading dialogue, making comments on them, suggest rewrites is a job. Again, lead writer, narrative director. If you feel like protecting your writers from unproductive feedbacks, that could happen and will likely happen during a table read or a script meeting, don't invite everyone to the meeting or ask them to make comments later without any writers involved. That's my advice. Take notes yourself or have someone do it. And that would be the last slides, 3 tips to take home with you, wrapping up this talk. So define your major plot points as early as possible. That's something I want, because I don't have time, I won't say much about it anymore, but you understood the key thing in there. Choose your dialogue sequences carefully, so active or passive dialogue at specific times in the game. And that's another big thing that I haven't said earlier, but make sure you have room to actually scope your rewriting as many times as necessary. If your story is core to your intentions, or if your dialogues in general are core to your game's intentions, actually find some room to rewrite and as much as necessary. Have a clear reading and feedbacks process, and that will help you to have the most comfortable, I would say, script writing process possible. And that would be the end of it. Thank you for attention, and you can actually add me on LinkedIn if you wish and have a chat afterwards.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you.
Now we have time for a couple of questions. Oh, I see already some raised hands.
Thank you. Hello, and thank you for
Hello.
the presentation. So, very curious about the table read. The scripts for video games are massive, right? They're much bigger than any movie. How do you manage to, I've never been through that process with such a big script and such a big team. You need to have all the leads there, the director, the actors. How long does it take, and how do you spread it out? Because I'm sure it takes more than a week to read through the entire thing. Do you remove the quests, side content, you just go straight for the main thing? How does that process go?
So for big games, I would say, I would probably focus, because I did that I worked on Beyond Good and Evil 2. Not going to give you a release date, but we actually worked on many GP lines with this kind of table reads. But on Mirage, I didn't do that because we were running out of time. So what I would probably advise is focus on maybe core moments that you want people to be aligned on, like cinematics team or animation team, and that would be probably cutscenes first. Then everything that is related to more GP lines and very scripted moments and everything, maybe focus on just giving them the script and having feedbacks on a separate document with these teams. So maybe game designers, level designers, quest designers, everybody who needs actually to have a view on these ones. But cutscenes first in a big AAA. But again, it's like, it's always a question of the time you have and the production constraints, but I would say if you want to focus on dialogue and story, and if you want to have good ones, then just find the time. It should be a priority in the scope. And if you don't have this priority in the scope, then probably you have to discuss the production pillars with the people who manage the game, because it's an issue if you don't have the time to rewrite and actually get the feedbacks.
You didn't say if there was anything else in particular.
Great. And I see a lot of raised hands, but I think that gentleman was first.
If it comes up. No worries.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the talk. Very interesting.
Thank you.
I also have like a background in movies, and what I struggle with in video games when we compare the quality of recorded dialogues. I believe we have some of the best voice actors possible in video games. However, I feel there is often this chemistry missing that you get from being recorded as two actors actually in the same room talking with each other. And sometimes when you see small examples, like when I remember the game the Rick and Morty creators did, when you just notice, okay, because they know each other, they can sit in the same room in the game, it's completely different quality level just by the natural chemistry of this happening. So do you have any idea how we might evolve in the industry to actually make the dialogue quality in the performance closer to what we have in movies?
Yeah, that's something I like to do working with actors, but I totally get what you mean. So first of all, working with different actors separately, it's really damaging to the overall performance. We did that for Mirage, and we had one actor per booth, and we had different sessions and different cities, and people were recording here and there. So it was a big issue on several levels. But the thing you're telling me about the chemistry, it's almost all the time when you have a chemistry, because sometimes that doesn't happen on a movie set. It's because you have time for coffee. You have time because the guys are just setting up the lights and everything. So you have time to actually chat and meet each other. You have table reads. You have rehearsals. Anything, this kind of stuff we don't have in video games mostly, because you have to pay for a recording session, and that's really, that's a strict process. So whenever you can, actually, yes, record the actors together in the booth. And if you manage, and I did that, I was not supposed to, but I actually had sessions of just chatting with the actors myself, just to make sure that we would, be aligned on the story, but just chat about the weather. It's just, making sure that everybody, can have a little a glimpse of what the other person is, who the other person is, and work from that and be more comfortable and everything. So yeah, you can maybe overstep and have some informal meetings with the actors. I'm just giving you, illegal stuff to do, but it's possible. Just become friends with the actors and make them, chat with each other and with you. That could help. But it's never going to replace the movie set atmosphere that I miss a lot. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I think we are up with time. So, quick question.
Okay.
Very quick question. Okay,
Super quick,
last question.
Super quick question. Thank you very much. Very, very good insights.
Thank you.
I'm also from a background from film. The previous question. So I was wondering, it feels like in games, there's not many games that use an uncanny narrator. BioShock is maybe like the one that comes to my mind.
Sorry, games with what? I'm sorry, I didn't.
An uncanny narrator that kind of...
Oh, an uncanny narrator.
Yes.
Okay.
And so I was wondering why, with you from a narrative background, why do you think that is? Because I feel like the medium works pretty well for it in terms of keeping the player in the dark about certain things, and obviously like many books and films do it, like Fight Club being one example.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I'm just trying to understand your question. It's whatever you don't put in dialogues, right? Whatever you don't put in dialogues, how do you put it somewhere else so that the player can...
Yeah, maybe it's why don't we fool the player more? I guess is what an uncanny narrative does. It sort of keeps the viewer in the dark, like leads them astray about certain things. So maybe it's, more complexity.
So whether you say things or you suggest things.
Yes,
right?
that are not true in the case of BioShock. I think they're stringing the player along, and then there's actually, you're revealing things that aren't as they are. Sorry, it's a bit of a complex question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not sure I get it. But if I don't get the question, we can talk afterwards, and I'll make sure I answer your question. But if your question is about having, when you say narrator, you mean a voiceover?
No, it's uncanny narrator. So it's a narrator that you can't trust. You can't trust what they're actually telling you to be true.
Oh, right. Okay, I got it. Okay. Wow, actually that would be a question more for literature. Because, because that's, the question of the narrator in video games is very specific. I mean, I've made an example of the Stanley Parable, which I love, because they kind of revisit the question of being a narrator in a video game, because a video game is, by essence, it's interactive. So what is the narrator bringing to the interactive side of this particular piece of art, which is the Stanley Parable? Well, they actually play with the player's intentions, and they try to they did a great job as just trying to figure out where the player is going to be and what he's going to do and what, So they play without the narrative. The narrator is tricking the player on this side. So they revisit this thing. But I don't think a narrator per se in video games is relevant unless it's actually narrative intention from the beginning, like in the Stanley Parable. So it's a very interesting question, but yeah, it comes from literature. I like that. We can talk about that afterwards if you wish.
Thank you.